The morning of the auction, there were 90 sheep nobody wanted. They stood in the back pen at the Bishop County Livestock Yard, pressed against the rails, the way animals press together when they have been moved too many times in too few days. Their wool hung in patches, matted and gray, where the burrs had caught. Their ribs showed through in the hollow places just behind the shoulder. Two of them favored the left front leg with a slight hitch that the auctioneer had already called out in a tone meant to discourage bidding, and one of them, a small ewe near the gate, was leaning against the rail with her eyes half closed in a way that suggested she had given up on the proceedings entirely. They looked like exactly what the catalog said they were, a discount lot of unimproved Tunis crosses out of a foreclosed farm 2 counties over. 90 head, no papers, no guarantees, no takers. The men at the rail laughed when the lot came up. They laughed harder when the bidding opened at $50 a head and dropped almost immediately to $20. They laughed loudest when a young woman in a brown canvas jacket, standing alone near the coffee urn, raised her paddle and held it there until the auctioneer, after a long pause meant to give her time to reconsider, brought the gavel down at $18 apiece for the entire lot. Cyrus Beecham, who was 79 years old and owned 400 acres of bottomland on the east side of the ridge and considered himself the unofficial judge of every transaction that passed through the yard, turned to the man beside him and said loud enough to carry that he had just watched somebody pay $1,620 for 90 future Coyote dinners. The man beside him laughed. The auctioneer, who knew the young woman's last name and therefore knew whose granddaughter she was, did not laugh. But he did not meet her eye either as he wrote up the ticket. She paid in cash from a folded envelope, signed for the lot, walked out to the loading chute without saying a word to anyone, and Cyrus Beecham, watching her go, said to no one in particular that the Whitfield place had been dying for 20 years, and now it had found a way to finish the job. If this story already has you leaning in, do me one small favor before we go further. Tap the like button, and in the comments tell me the name of the town or city you're watching from, because I read every single one of them and I want to know where in the world this story is landing tonight. Now let's begin. Her name was Opal Whitfield. She was 23 years old, and 2 months before she stood at the back rail of that livestock yard with a folded envelope of cash and a paddle in her hand, she had never in her life bought a single animal. She had come back to the ridge in March of that year, not because she had a plan, but because there was no longer anywhere else for her to be. Her grandmother, Ida Whitfield, was 81 and had broken her hip the previous fall. The cousins who had been taking turns driving up the gravel road to check on her had run out of turns. Opal had been finishing a 2-year associate degree in a town 3 hours south, working nights at a diner off the interstate, sharing an apartment with 2 girls she did not particularly like. And when the call came from her aunt in Bowling Green, she packed her car in an afternoon and drove home without telling the diner she was not coming back. The drive took her up out of the Cumberland Flats and into the foothills, past pastures, still yellow with winter, past barns, with the paint gone silver from 30 years of weather, past a Baptist church her grandfather had helped roof in 1974. And when she turned off the highway onto the county road and then off the county road onto the gravel drive that ran a 1/4 mile up the slope, she felt something she had not felt in almost 5 years, which was the specific weight of coming home to a place that had never quite let her go. The farm, when she pulled up the drive, looked smaller than she remembered, and also somehow larger, the way places do when you return to them as an adult. The house was a 2-story frame with a tin roof that her grandfather Silas had put on himself in 1974. The paint on the south side had faded to the color of an old dime. The barn leaned slightly to the south, which it had been doing for as long as anyone could remember. There were 68 acres altogether, most of it sloped pasture that had been let go to broom sedge and cedar saplings, a creek that ran along the western fence line, and a stand of hardwood at the back of the property that her grandfather had refused to let anyone log, even when the money was offered and badly needed. Ida was sitting on the porch when Opal pulled up. She did not stand, she did not wave, and when Opal came up the steps carrying nothing but her canvas jacket over one arm, her grandmother looked at her for a long moment and said, "Well, you came." Opal said she had. Ida said, "Sit down then," and the two of them sat on the porch in the cold March air and watched a hawk work the field below the house. And that was the entirety of their reunion. That was Ida's way. That was Opal came to understand what love looked like in that house. Not the reaching kind, the steady kind, the kind that had raised 3 children and buried 2 of them and stayed on the ridge through winters that broke other women. The first 3 weeks, Opal did almost nothing but learn the rhythm of the house. She cooked the breakfasts and the suppers, biscuits and gravy and eggs in the morning, cornbread and beans and whatever meat Ida had in the deep freeze at night. She drove her grandmother to the physical therapy appointments at the clinic in Liberty. She walked the fence line in the afternoons because her grandmother told her to, and she came back with reports that Ida received without comment, nodding once and going back to whatever she was doing with her hands, which was usually mending something that did not strictly need to be mended. The days had a shape to them, a slowness that was not laziness, but something older, something the ridge required of anyone who lived on it long enough. Opal fell into that shape without resisting, and in the falling she began to notice things. The creek ran clean and steady, even in the dry weeks of late March, which was unusual for a creek that size on a ridge that high. The hardwood stand at the back of the property held a kind of cool damp under it that the surrounding ridges did not. The leaf litter there was deep and black in a way that suggested water moving through the ground beneath it. In the lower pasture there was a patch maybe a 1/4 acre across where the grass came in earlier and greener every spring than the grass around it, and the cattle that the neighbor had been allowed to run on the place years ago had always grazed that patch down first. Opal made notes about these things in a small spiral notebook she had bought at the gas station on her second day home, not because she had any plan for the notes, but because making them felt like something a person ought to do. In the evening she would sit at the kitchen table and write down what she had seen, and her grandmother, sitting across from her with her mending, would sometimes glance at the notebook and sometimes ask a one-word question. "Where?" "Below the second gate." "How wet?" "My boot went in an inch." And Opal would answer, and Ida would nod and go back to her sewing, and that was most of what passed between them in those first weeks, which was, Opal came to understand later, a great deal more communication than it appeared to be. The land was by any conventional measure not worth farming. The soil test from the extension office, which Opal found in a drawer in the kitchen, along with 30 years of similar papers, said the topsoil was thin. The slope was wrong for row crops. The pH was off in ways that would cost more to correct than the resulting hay would ever sell for. Cyrus Beecham had offered to lease the pasture for grazing twice in the last 5 years and had been refused both times, and the second refusal had ended a long acquaintance between him and Ida that neither of them had bothered to mourn. The Whitfield place, in other words, was understood by everyone in the valley to be a piece of ground that had outlived its usefulness, kept alive by an old woman's stubbornness, and waiting only for her to die so that someone with sense could finally do something else with it. Coming up in a few minutes, Opal is going to open a drawer she had no business opening and find something that will change the way she looks at every inch of that 68 acres. But first, you need to understand who Silas Whitfield was, because everything that happens on this ridge from here on out is because of him. Silas Whitfield was born in a farmhouse on the same ridge in 1938. His father had come up from Tennessee before the First World War and homesteaded the parcel with an old harness horse and a mattock. His mother taught school in Liberty until she married and then never again. Silas was the third of 4 boys, and by the time he was 10 years old, he could shoe a mule read weather off a sky and tell you within 2 feet where the water table sat under any given patch of ground on that ridge. That last part he learned from his father, who had learned it from his own father in a hollow in eastern Tennessee back when the science of it had a different name. The technique was called dowsing, and most of the people who knew anything about it were dead by the time Silas married Ida in 1968. He did not talk about it much. He did not claim any mystical understanding of what he did, but he could walk a piece of ground with a forked willow stick and tell you where to put a well. And in a county where more than half the wells drilled in the last 50 years had come in dry or brackish, Silas Whitfield had never missed a strike he was hired for. He never charged for it either. He did other things for money. He drove a truck for a feed cooperative. He roofed houses. He built a small welding shop behind the barn where he took in machine repairs for the farms along the county road. And in the last 20 years of his life, when the boys were grown and gone and the farm had stopped paying for itself, he kept the family alive on the $700 a month the county paid him to keep the roads clear in winter. He died in the spring of 2015, 77 years old, a stroke at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning while Ida was pouring his coffee. They had been married 47 years. Ida had not mentioned him more than a handful of times in the 11 years since, which Opal, who had known her grandmother her whole life, understood not as forgetting, but as the opposite. Some kinds of grief are so complete that speaking around them is safer than speaking of them. It was on a Tuesday in the second week of April that her grandmother, looking up from a sock she was darning, said, "Your grandfather kept a book." Opal, who had been reading a seed catalog she had no intention of ordering from, set the catalog down and said, "What kind of book?" Ida said, "The kind a man keeps when he is paying attention." She said it was in the cedar chest at the foot of the bed in the back room, and that Opal could read it if she wanted, and that it would either mean something to her or it would not, and either way it was hers now. Then she went back to the sock. Opal did not go look for the book that night. She waited until the next afternoon when her grandmother was napping, and she went into the back room and opened the cedar chest, and there under a folded quilt and a stack of yellowed Farm Bureau magazines, and a shoebox of photographs that she did not stop to look through was a leather-bound ledger about the size of a family Bible, with the name Silas Whitfield stamped in faded gold on the cover, and a date below it that read 1958. She sat down on the floor of the back room with the ledger across her knees, and she opened it. The first thing she saw was a hand-drawn map. It filled the entire first page, 68 acres rendered in pencil and ink with elevation lines her grandfather had traced in careful crosshatch, and the county road marked at the bottom in a firmer black. The creek ran along the western edge in a wandering blue line. The house was a small square in the northeast corner. The hardwood stand at the back was a scatter of tiny circles, each one drawn with what looked like real attention, and spread across the map in a hand so precise it might have been printed were small notations, dozens of them. Seep, March through June, clay shelf, 18 inches down, old well, capped 1941, never failed in spring, cedar breaks cut back yearly. The notations went on, page after page. There were arrows showing the direction of subsurface flow as her grandfather understood it. There were small numbered circles keyed to longer entries in the back of the book, where he had written paragraphs about each location in a prose that was plain and unhurried, and entirely free of the kind of speculation Opal had braced herself for. The hardwood stand at the back of the property had 11 numbered circles in it. The quarter-acre patch in the lower pasture, the one that greened up early every year, had 3. The creek had notations along its entire length, including a stretch about 50 yards above the western fence, where her grandfather had written in slightly larger letters than the rest, "Water comes up here from below. Do not disturb until needed." Opal read for 2 hours that afternoon, and when she came out of the back room to start supper, she had the ledger under her arm, and her grandmother, who was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee gone cold in front of her, looked at her face and said, "So you found it." Opal said she had. Ida said he believed there was water under this place more than anyone knew. She said it looking not at Opal but at the window above the sink, at the ridge line beyond it going blue in the fading light. He used to say the ridge was holding it like a sponge holds a spill, that one day somebody would figure out how to use it. Opal asked why he had never tried to use it himself. Her grandmother thought about that for a long moment, long enough that Opal began to wonder if the question had been the wrong one to ask. Then Ida said, because he was busy raising children and making the mortgage, and because the people who would have laughed at him were the same people who held the loans. She looked at Opal for the first time since Opal had come out of the back room. He was a proud man. He was not a foolish one. Then she said, "Eat your supper." And that was the end of the conversation. But Opal went to bed that night with the ledger on her chest, and she lay awake for a long time staring at the ceiling, and somewhere in the middle of that long awake stretch she began, without quite deciding to think about sheep. She thought about sheep because of something else her grandmother had said weeks earlier in passing, when Opal had asked why the back pasture had been let go. Ida had said that cattle were too heavy for that ground, that her grandfather had always wanted to try sheep on it, but had never gotten around to it. Opal, who knew almost nothing about sheep, had filed the comment away the way she filed most of what her grandmother said, which was carefully and without immediate use. But now, with the ledger open on the nightstand and her grandfather's handwriting in her head, the comment came back. Sheep were light on the ground. Sheep would graze the broom sedge and the cedar saplings down without compacting the soil. Sheep would, if her grandfather's notes were right about the seeps and the springs, find their own water in places a cattle herd could not. And sheep, more to the point, were cheap to get into if you bought the kind of sheep nobody else wanted. She did not sleep well that night, but she slept when she finally slept with a decision made that she had not quite finished making yet. The next morning, over eggs and coffee, she said to her grandmother, "I want to try something." Ida did not look up from her plate. "All right, I want to buy sheep." Ida chewed, swallowed, reached for her coffee. "How many?" "As many as I can afford." "With what?" Opal had been thinking about this. She had saved $1,400 from the diner job. She had another $200 in an account her mother had left her before she died, and she knew because she had gone through the same kitchen drawer that had held the soil tests that her grandmother had a small emergency envelope in the coffee tin above the stove with something like $300 in it, though neither of them had ever spoken of it. $1,900 if you'll spot me 3. Ida took a long sip of her coffee, set the cup down, looked at Opal for the first time that morning. "Buy them cheap." "I mean to. Buy them at the yard." "That's where I was thinking." Ida nodded. "Once. Your grandfather," she said, "would have liked this." She said it without warmth, the way she said everything, as a fact offered for consideration. Opal took it that way, and she went out to the porch and stood for a long time looking at the lower pasture and the ridge beyond it, and the sky, which was doing something it had been threatening to do for a week, which was to finally warm. And that was on a Thursday. The auction was on Saturday. Now stay with me, because before we get to that auction, before we come back around to those 90 sheep and Cyrus Beecham's laughter, there is one more thing Opal was going to find in that kitchen drawer, and it is the thing that will make you understand what she is really up against. The drawer was in the kitchen, beneath the phone. Opal had been through it once already the day she found the soil tests, but she had been looking for one specific thing, and she had not lingered over the rest. On the Friday morning before the auction, the morning after she made her decision about the sheep, she opened the drawer again, not looking for anything in particular, just needing the way you sometimes need in the last quiet hours before a decision becomes irrevocable, to feel some connection to the people who had lived in this house before her. The drawer held 40 years of paper, property tax receipts folded in half, insurance premium notices with the envelopes still stapled to them, a birthday card from a great-aunt Opal had never met dated 1987, 3 or 4 letters from her father who had died in a highway accident when she was 9, addressed in his round handwriting to Silas and Ida, a veterinary bill from 1978 for a mule named Judson, and near the bottom, folded twice and tucked inside an unmarked white envelope, a single-page letter typed on cream-colored stationery. The letterhead at the top read, "Beecham Properties, Casey County, Kentucky." The date was March of 1971. Opal did not read the letter standing up. She sat down at the kitchen table with it and read it twice, and then she read it a third time. The letter was addressed to Silas Whitfield, and it was signed in a firm, angular hand by Cyrus Beecham. The letter offered to purchase from Silas Whitfield a specific parcel of the Whitfield homestead, namely 30 acres running along the western fence line and including the stretch of creek and the 2 seasonal springs known to exist on the property. The letter did not use the words water rights. It used the phrase riparian and subsurface interests, appurtenant to the parcel described herein, but that was what it meant. Cyrus Beecham was offering to buy the water. The offer was for $8,000 in 1971 on a farm that was already struggling to make the mortgage. $8,000 was not a small sum. It was Opal calculated later, roughly 2 full years of what her grandfather was earning at the feed cooperative. It was the kind of money that could have paid off the note on the tractor, or replaced the barn roof, or set aside something for the boys' schooling. At the bottom of the letter in her grandfather's handwriting in pencil was a single notation: "He knows, but he doesn't know as much as I do." Opal sat at the kitchen table for a long time with the letter in her hand. Her grandmother came into the kitchen at some point to refill her coffee. She saw what Opal was reading. She did not say anything. She refilled the coffee and stood at the counter with her back to Opal for a long moment, and then she said without turning around, "That was one of 3. Opal looked up. "One of 3 what?" "Offers." Ida turned around then and leaned against the counter and crossed her arms over her chest the way she did when she was preparing to say something she had put off saying for a long time. "Cyrus made your grandfather 3 offers on this place. That one in 71, another in 82, the last one after your grandfather got sick in the spring before he died, each one for a piece of it, each one for the piece with the water. You never sold. He never sold. Why?" Ida looked at her for a long moment. "Because your grandfather had known Cyrus Beecham since they were both boys on this ridge, and your grandfather understood something about him that Cyrus did not understand about himself." She uncrossed her arms, turned back to the counter, picked up her coffee. "Cyrus never wanted the land," she said. "He wanted what he could not have." Opal did not ask what that meant, not that morning, because there was a way her grandmother had said it that closed the door on further questions, but she put the letter in the ledger folded between the map page and the notation index, and she carried both of them with her when she left the house on Saturday morning for the auction. She did not tell Ida what she had put in the ledger. She did not need to. Some things on that ridge were understood without being said. The auction was held every Saturday at 8 in the morning at the Bishop County Livestock Yard, which sat on a flat parcel just outside the town of Liberty. It had been there since 1953. The metal roof was original. The concrete had been poured in 6 sections at different times over the years, and you could see where each section met the next by the color of the cement. Opal arrived at 7:30 in a borrowed stock trailer hitched to her own car with a folded envelope of $1,900 in the inside pocket of her canvas jacket, and no clear plan for what she was going to do with the trailer if she did not manage to buy anything to put in it. She had never been to a livestock auction alone. She had been to 2 with her grandfather when she was small. She remembered the smell of the place, damp concrete and diesel, and the particular musk of animals kept close together. She remembered the way her grandfather had walked through the pens before the sale, running his hand along the top rail, looking without seeming to look. She remembered the way he had bid without visible movement, so that only the auctioneer knew he was bidding at all. She walked through the pens now, the way he had walked through them, slowly, without stopping, running her hand along the top rail. Most of the lots were cattle, feeder calves and a few pairs, and one old milk cow with a bag that told you her productive years were behind her. There was a lot of 6 horses that looked like a family dispersal. There were 3 pens of goats, and in the very back in the pen that had the worst light and the least drainage, there were the sheep, 90 head. Opal stopped at the rail of that pen for what she later remembered as the longest 3 minutes of her life up to that point. They looked exactly as the catalog described them, which was to say they looked terrible. But she stood there, and she made herself look past the wool and the ribs and the general air of animal defeat, and she made herself see what her grandfather would have seen, which was 90 sets of legs, 90 sets of teeth she could not check from where she stood, but which she trusted to be on average sound enough. 90 animals that had been through a hard winter on a foreclosed farm and had come out the other side, which meant whatever else they were survivors. The small ewe, leaning against the rail near the gate, turned her head slightly and looked at Opal, and Opal looked back at her. That was the whole of it. Then Opal walked away from the pen and went to stand near the coffee urn at the back of the ring, and she took the paddle the yard clerk had given her at check-in, and she waited. The sheep came up at 9:40 in the morning. The auctioneer, whose name was Wendell Combs, had been calling auctions at this yard for 31 years. He was in his late 60s, thin as a fence post, with a stoop in his shoulders that came from leaning down to the microphone for 3 decades. He knew the Whitfield name because he had known Silas since they were both young men. He also knew, in the way of men who spend their working lives in a livestock yard, exactly what a lot of 90 unimproved Tunis crosses was and was not likely to bring on a Saturday morning in May. Wendell opened the bidding at $50 a head. There were no bids. He came down to 40, then 30, then 25. The laughter began at 25. Cyrus Beecham was standing on the opposite side of the ring from Opal. She had seen him when she walked in. She knew who he was. He had been at her grandfather's funeral, standing at the back of the church with his hat in his hands, and he had left before the graveside service. Ida had not acknowledged him. He had not tried to make her acknowledge him. He was 79 years old now, tall, still holding his shoulders straight, wearing a canvas coat older than Opal was, and a cap that had faded from red to something closer to rust. He was the one who called out when the bidding dropped to 20 that somebody ought to just put the poor things down and save the buyer the trouble. The men around him laughed. Wendell Combs at the microphone did not laugh. He said, "I've got 20. Do I have 21? And Opal raised her paddle. She raised it and held it there, not looking at Cyrus Beecham, not looking at the men at the rail, looking at Wendell Combs at the microphone, because he was the only person in that room she trusted to be honest with her about what she was doing. Wendell looked back at her. Then he said into the microphone, "I've got 18. Do I have 19? There was a small stir at the rail, because 18 was less than 20, and bidding was not supposed to go down. But Wendell Combs had called this yard for 31 years, and nobody was going to argue with him about which direction the bidding went on. A lot of sheep nobody wanted. He held it there. He gave the room a long moment to make itself known. Nobody moved. He said, $18 a head, 90 head, $1,620 for the lot, sold to the young lady in the brown jacket. and he brought the gavel down. The laughter that followed was the kind you heard in a place like that when the room did not know what else to do. It was not entirely cruel, but it was not kind either. Cyrus Beecham made his remark about coyote dinners. The man beside him laughed. The men around them laughed. And Opal, who had felt her whole body go cold when Wendell dropped the price for her, walked out to the office to pay for the sheep without looking at any of them. She paid in cash. From the folded envelope, $1,620 counted out on the yard clerk's desk. She signed the ticket. She walked out to the loading chute where Otis Kessler, a 17-year-old neighbor's son she had hired that morning for $40 in supper and gas money, was already backing the borrowed stock trailer up to the gate. And behind her in the ring, Cyrus Beecham was already turning to the next man over, saying loud enough for it to carry, "Well, the Whitfield place has been dying for 20 years. Now it's found a way to finish the job." The man he said it to laughed. Opal heard him. She did not turn around. She walked to the loading chute, and she opened the gate, and she began with Otis Kessler beside her holding a stock cane he had borrowed from his father to load 90 sheep nobody wanted into a rented trailer for the drive back up the ridge. They made 2 trips. By the time the last trailer was unloaded at the lower pasture and the sheep were spreading down the slope in a loose, ragged line, it was almost 4 o'clock in the afternoon. The sun was starting to come at that low angle that turns the ridges gold. The broom sedge in the pasture was catching the light, and 90 animals that had been standing in a concrete pen for 36 hours were one by one putting their heads down to the grass. Otis stood at the gate with his hands on the top rail and watched them. "There's a lot of them," he said. "There is. You know what you're doing." It was not a question. It was the way a 17-year-old boy said something he wanted to be true because he had just spent 8 hours helping a grown woman do a thing he did not entirely understand. Opal said, "Not yet, but I mean to." Otis nodded. He watched the sheep for another long moment. Then he said, "That one's not going to make it." He was pointing at the small ewe near the fence who had walked maybe 20 yards from the trailer and then laid down in the grass and had not gotten up. Opal looked at her. "We'll see." Ida was on the porch with a blanket over her knees when Opal came up the path from the pasture. She had been out there the whole afternoon, watching the trailers come and go, watching the sheep spread across the field. She had not called out. She had not come down. She said 90 head, for $18 each. "Yes, ma'am." Ida was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Your grandfather would have liked this." Opal said, "I hope so." Ida said he would have. She did not say it warmly. She said it the way she said everything, which was as a fact offered for consideration, and Opal took it that way. And the two of them sat on the porch in the last of the light and watched the sheep in the lower pasture, and the field went blue and then black. Somewhere in the dark, a coyote called once from the hardwood stand. Ida turned her head slightly, listening. The coyote did not call again, but she stayed listening for a long time, and Opal, sitting beside her, did not know yet how much that single call would come to matter, did not know that within 3 months, on a night in July, the coyotes would come down off that ridge in a way that would test everything she thought she had learned about the ground beneath her. She only knew that her grandmother was listening, and that some things on the ridge were understood without being said. That was the first night the Whitfield place had carried livestock in 11 years. The first month passed the way months pass on a ridge that has taken back its animals after a long absence, slowly at first, then all at once. 3 of the 90 sheep died in the first 10 days, which Otis Kessler, who came by most afternoons, now whether he had been asked to or not said, was about what you would expect from a discount lot out of a foreclosed farm. Opal buried them at the edge of the hardwood stand and marked the spots in her notebook, not because she needed to remember, but because writing things down had become the way she thought. The remaining 87 sheep settled into the lower pasture and began to do what sheep do, which was to eat the things in front of them with a methodical disinterest that Opal found against her expectations deeply restful to watch. She learned their faces in the first 2 weeks. She did not name them. She held that line. She almost held that line. The small ewe who had leaned on the rail at the auction and who had lain down in the grass that first afternoon turned out to be the one who came to the gate every morning when Opal brought the salt block. And Opal found herself by the end of the first month calling her lean without quite having decided to. Ida, observing this from the porch, said nothing, but she noticed, and Opal noticed her noticing. The pasture changed faster than Opal had thought it would. The broom sedge, which had stood waist-high in patches for years, was gone in 3 weeks. The cedar saplings which the sheep would not eat, but which Otis cut down with a handsaw on Saturdays for $2 apiece, came out of the ground in clumps and left bare circles that the grass began to fill in almost immediately. By the middle of May, the lower pasture looked like a pasture again, which it had not looked like in over a decade. The green patch that had always greened up early was now indistinguishable from the rest of the field, which Opal noted in her book as a thing to think about. She also noted on a Tuesday in late May that the sheep had begun to drift in the hottest part of the afternoon toward the western fence line, toward the stretch of creek where her grandfather had written water comes up here from below. She walked down to the spot one evening after the sheep had moved off. She crouched at the edge of the creek and put her hand in the water, and she held it there. The water was cold in a way that surface water in late May is not cold. It was the cold of water that had come up from somewhere deep. She stayed crouched there for a long time, watching a small silvered minnow work the edge of the moss on a stone, watching a dragonfly land on a cattail and take off again. She did not say anything to her grandmother about it that night. She wrote it down in the notebook. She underlined it once, and she went to bed. The first wool came off the sheep in the 2nd week of June. His name was Ellis Booker. He drove up the gravel road on a Thursday morning in a pickup truck with a set of electric shears and a rubberized mat rolled up in the bed. He was, it turned out, the only man in 3 counties who still traveled to farms this small to cut wool. Wendell Combs had given her his name the week after the auction over a coffee. Wendell had insisted on paying for at the diner in Liberty without her ever having asked. Ellis set up in the barn. Opal, who had spent 2 evenings watching videos on her phone about how the process was supposed to go, watched him instead, and learned more in the first hour than she had learned from the videos in 2 evenings. Ellis was 67, broad through the shoulders where Wendell Combs had been thin. He had hands that had been doing this work since he was 14 years old, when his father had first put a pair of blade shears in his hands on a farm outside Somerset and told him to figure it out. He had figured it out, and he had been figuring it out for 53 years since. His hands moved without the appearance of moving. The shears slid across the wool, and the wool came off in a single piece. And the ewe stood up when it was done and shook herself once and walked out into the sun looking like a different animal. He worked from 6 in the morning until 7 at night for a day and a half. He charged Opal $1.50 a head, which was less than the going rate and which he did not explain. At the end of the second day, he stood in the barn with his hands on the small of his back and looked at the pile of wool he had bagged in the corner. And he said, "This is not bad wool." Opal said, "No." He said, "No, it's not." Then he said it was coarser than the merino he usually ran into, but that it had a length and a crimp to it that hand spinners would pay for if she could find them, and that she was not going to get rich on it, but that she should not let the buyer in town tell her it was worth nothing, because it was not worth nothing. Then he did something Opal had not expected. He sat down on a bale of straw, and he took his cap off, and he set it on his knee, and he looked at Opal for a long moment before he spoke. "I sheared your grandfather's wool," he said, "for 12 years. Opal did not say anything. He kept about 40 head back then, same breed you've got. He said the same thing about them. He said they walked the ground lighter than cattle did, and that the ground had told him what it wanted, and what it wanted was sheep." Ellis turned the cap in his hands. He didn't say much, but when he said something, he meant it. I learned to listen to men who don't say much. Opal said, "He passed in the spring of 15. I know it. I was at the service." She had not remembered him being there, but there had been a lot of men at that service she had not remembered. Ellis said, "He told me once the last summer I cut for him. This was maybe 2013, I couldn't say for sure. He told me the sheep were just the beginning." Opal felt something in her chest go still. He said the ground under this place was going to speak up eventually, and that when it did, somebody was going to have to be ready to listen. He looked at her. I don't know what he meant by that. He wouldn't say, but I thought about it a lot after he was gone, and I thought about it again when Wendell told me you'd bought that lot at the yard. He put the cap back on his head. "He'd have liked what you're doing," he said. "That's all I came to say." Then he stood up, and he pulled a small piece of paper out of his shirt pocket, and he wrote a name and a phone number on the back of a feed receipt with a pencil stub he kept behind his ear. The name was Faye Dinkins. "She runs a fiber co-op down in Bourbon County," Ellis said. "She buys direct from small producers. You call her. Tell her I sent you." He handed Opal the receipt. "She'll do right by you." He drove off without taking coffee. Opal called Faye Dinkins that evening from the kitchen phone. Faye asked questions for 20 minutes. She wanted to know the breed. She wanted to know the length and the crimp. She wanted to know what the sheep had been fed and where they had been kept. She wanted to know if the wool had been skirted and if there was any staining in the bags. She wanted to know at the end of the 20 minutes whether Opal was Silas Whitfield's granddaughter. Opal said she was. Faye was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "I'll take the whole clip, $4 a pound. Sight unseen on Ellis's word. I'll drive up Saturday with cash and a trailer." Opal hung up the phone. She stood in the kitchen for a long moment. Then she went out to the porch where her grandmother was shelling peas into a colander in her lap, and she told her that the wool had just sold for more than the sheep had cost. Ida did not stop shelling. She said, "Well." Then she said, "That is a start." Then she went back to the peas, It was the closest thing to praise that Opal was going to receive from her grandmother that year, and she carried it around for days like a stone warm from a pocket. Now, before I go any further, I want you to tell me something in the comments. I want you to tell me about a person in your life who did not say much, but who, when they said something, meant it, because those are the people who shape a life. And I have a feeling a lot of you know exactly the kind of person I'm talking about. Now back to the ridge. The talk at the feed store started in early July. Cyrus Beecham, who came in on Wednesdays for the company more than the supplies, was the one who started it, although he would later claim when pressed that he had only been repeating what other people were already saying. What other people were already saying, according to Cyrus, was that the Whitfield girl had paid $18 a head for 90 doomed sheep and was now somehow not losing money on them, which Cyrus attributed to beginner's luck and the unusually wet spring and the fact that she had not yet had to deal with a real winter or a real predator loss or a real veterinary bill, and which he predicted with the confidence of a man who had been right about livestock for 40 years, would correct itself by Christmas. The name skeptic, in other words, had taken the field. The men at the feed store listened to Cyrus the way they always listened to Cyrus, which was with a kind of habitual half-agreement that did not require them to commit to anything. The conversation moved on to other things, but the seed had been planted, and by the second week of July, it was generally understood in the valley that the Whitfield girl was running a sort of slow-motion failure on the ridge, and that the only question was how long it would take her to figure it out and sell the place to someone who could use it properly. Opal, who heard about the talk from Otis, who heard about it from his father, who heard about it at the feed store, received the news without visible reaction. She said, "That's one approach." She said it to Otis, who repeated it to his father, who did not repeat it to anyone because he was not sure what it meant. What Opal was actually doing that July, while Cyrus Beecham was predicting her failure at the feed store, was three things. She was reading the ledger, cover to cover, for the second time. She was walking the ridge in the early mornings and the last hour of daylight, testing every notation her grandfather had made against what she could see with her own eyes, and finding almost every time that he had been right. And she was thinking in the small hours of the night when she could not sleep about the western fence line, about the stretch of creek 50 yards above it, and about the sentence her grandfather had written in slightly larger letters than the rest. "Water comes up here from below. Do not disturb until needed." She did not know yet what needed meant. She only knew that she was not ready to disturb it. Not yet, but she was starting to understand something else, something the sheep had been trying to tell her since the middle of May. The sheep had been drifting to that stretch of creek every hot afternoon, not because it was the closest water. It was not the closest. There were two nearer troughs. They were drifting to it because the water there was cold, and because sheep, like most animals, are smarter than the people who mock them. The ground was speaking, the sheep were listening, and Opal was learning slowly to listen too. It happened on a Wednesday night in the second week of July. The heat had been building for a week, the kind of heat that settles into the ridges and does not lift, not even at night. Opal had gone to bed at 10. The sheep were folded loose in the lower pasture, not penned. She had not built a pen yet. She had been meaning to. She had not. She woke at 1:40 in the morning. She did not know at first what had woken her. Then she heard it, a sound she had never heard before, but understood immediately. A high, thin sound, not a scream, not exactly, something older than a scream, something that came out of an animal that had run out of options and was making the last sound it knew how to make. Then another, and under it, low and terrible, the sound of many things moving at once through grass. She was out of bed before she was fully awake, down the stairs in her sleep shirt and the boots she kept by the door. She grabbed her grandfather's Winchester off the hooks above the mantel, where it had hung for 11 years and had not been fired in longer than that. She grabbed the box of shells from the drawer beneath it. She was on the porch before she remembered a flashlight, and she went back for one. And when she came out again, Ida was standing in the doorway in a nightgown with a shawl over her shoulders, barefoot, watching her. Ida did not say anything. Opal did not say anything. She loaded the Winchester on the porch. 2 rounds. She did not know if her hands were shaking. She was moving too fast to know. She ran down the path to the lower pasture with the flashlight in one hand and the rifle in the other. She could hear the sound better now. Multiple sheep, panicked, and under it, moving through them, the low working sound of predators that have found what they came for and are taking their time about it. She got to the gate. She swept the light across the field, and what the flashlight beam picked up was not what she had prepared herself to see. She had expected 2 coyotes, maybe 3. What she saw was 6. 6 of them, working together, 2 at the near edge of the flock harrying the ewes back toward the fence, 2 more in the middle, 2 at the far end. It was not opportunistic feeding. It was a hunt, coordinated, practice. Opal later would not be able to remember the exact order of what happened next. She remembered raising the Winchester and firing once into the air because she did not want to hit a sheep in the dark. She remembered the coyotes' heads coming up, all 6 of them, looking at her. She remembered the strange still moment when they decided whether she was a threat worth respecting. She fired the second round at the ground in front of the nearest one. The dirt kicked up. The coyote flinched, turned, looked back at the pack, and then, in the way of animals that have understood something, all 6 of them melted back through the fence line and up the slope toward the hardwood stand, and were gone. The sound of the sheep was worse in the silence that followed. Opal walked out into the pasture with a flashlight, and she made herself count. 2 ewes were dead, 1 at the near edge of the flock, 1 in the middle. The one in the middle was lean. 3 more were injured, 1 with a bad tear on the flank that Opal would need to call a vet about in the morning, 1 with a bite on the neck, 1 who had gone down and could not get up. Opal knelt in the grass next to Lean, and she put her hand on the ew's side, because the ewe was still warm, and because it was the only thing she could think to do. She stayed there in the grass for what she remembered later as a long time, but which was, when she thought about it, after probably not more than 2 minutes. Then she went to work. She spent the rest of the night dragging the 2 dead ewes to the edge of the hardwood stand. She would not have Otis or the vet see them lying in the field in the morning. She could do this one thing for them. She got the downed ewe up on her feet with Otis's help when he came running up the road at 3 in the morning, having heard the shots from his father's place a half-mile down the ridge. Otis had brought his father's flashlight and a stock cane, and without either of them saying anything about it, a shovel. They worked in silence. Ida stayed on the porch, awake, watching. Around 4:30, when the eastern sky was starting to gray, Opal walked back up to the house. Otis had gone home to get an hour of sleep before he had to be at his summer job. The 3 injured ewes were bandaged as well as she could bandage them until the vet came. The rest of the flock was standing in a tight cluster near the barn, silent, the way sheep get when they have decided that something has just happened that they cannot understand. Ida was still on the porch. Opal sat down on the step below her. She did not say anything for a long moment. Then she said, "Too." Ida said, "I heard the shots. I lost Lean." Ida did not say anything to that. Opal put her head down on her knees. She did not cry. She was too tired to cry. She just put her head down. After a while, Ida said without touching her, "You will lose more." Opal did not look up. "But you will lose fewer than most, because you watch." She said it in the same flat tone. She said everything. Opal did not answer. She could not answer. She just kept her head on her knees. And after another long moment, Ida said, "Come inside. I'll make coffee." The sun came up while the coffee was on the stove. The vet came at 8:30. By 9:30, the 3 injured ewes had been sutured and treated and dosed. Opal had paid the vet $340 in cash from the wool money envelope, which she had been keeping in a coffee tin above the stove now, in a habit she had picked up from her grandmother without noticing. At 10, while Opal was on the porch with a coffee gone cold in her hand, a truck came up the gravel drive. She did not recognize the truck at first. Then she did. It was Cyrus Beecham's truck. She stood up. Cyrus did not get out. He pulled up in the yard. He rolled the window down. He looked at her across the yard, and he said in a voice loud enough to carry across the distance, "Heard the shots last night." Opal did not say anything. "How many'd you lose?" "2." Cyrus nodded once, slowly, in the way of a man who was confirming something he had already decided. "Told you," he said. He said it not cruelly, not warmly either. He said it the way a man says a thing he has been waiting to say. He said it in the tone of a verdict. Then he rolled the window up, and he backed his truck down the gravel drive, and he drove away. Opal stood on the porch for a long time after he was gone. Then she went inside, and she sat down at the kitchen table, and for the first time since she had come home in March, she cried. Ida did not come into the kitchen. Ida, in her wisdom, stayed on the porch and gave her that one thing. Opal cried for about 10 minutes, and then she stopped, and she washed her face at the sink, and she came out to the porch, and she sat down next to her grandmother, and her grandmother, without looking at her, said, "Now, are you done?" Opal said, "I'm done." Ida said, "Good." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "There is a dog." Opal looked at her. Ida said, "Down in Madison County, a Great Pyrenees, 6 months old. I called the man in March. Before you came home, I meant to tell you when it was time." She turned her head slightly and looked at Opal for the first time that morning. "I think it is time." The dog came the next day. Otis and Opal drove the 2 hours down to Madison County in Otis's father's truck and picked the dog up from a small farm outside of Berea. He was 6 months old and already 90 pounds. His coat was the color of unwashed wool. His feet were the size of coffee cans. His eyes were the yellow-brown of a river in the shallows. The man who sold him said his name was Brindle, which was not the color of his coat, but it was the name that had stuck. So Brindle he was. The man charged $200, which Opal paid from the wool money. Ida had covered the deposit in March, $200, on a call Opal had not known she had made. They drove Brindle up the ridge in the bed of the truck, with the rope loose around his neck for form's sake. He did not need the rope. He rode with his head over the side of the bed and the wind in his ears, and looked to Opal's eye like an animal that had been waiting his whole short life for exactly this drive. When they got to the farm, Opal opened the tailgate. Brindle jumped down. He looked at the barn. He looked at the house. He looked at Ida on the porch. He looked at the lower pasture where the sheep were standing in their tight cluster. And then, without any instruction from anyone, he walked down the slope, straight to the flock. He did not run. He walked, slowly, deliberately, like a man coming home from a long day. The sheep parted for him and closed behind him, and Brindle lay down in the middle of them and put his head on his paws and looked out across the field with the same steady patience he would show for the next 12 years. Ida, on the porch, said, "He knows what he is." Opal said, "He does." Ida said, "That's more than most of us ever figure out." She said it looking not at the dog, but at Opal, and Opal understood. For the first time in 2 days, Opal smiled. The Coyotes came back once more that summer, on a night in August, 3 of them, testing. Brindle stood up in the middle of the flock. He did not bark. He did not move toward them. He just stood up, 90 pounds and growing, yellow eyes catching the moonlight. The 3 coyotes stopped at the fence line. They looked at Brindle. Brindle looked back, and after a long moment, the coyotes turned and went back up the ridge, and did not come to the lower pasture again for the rest of that year. Opal watched all of this from the porch, in the dark, without a rifle in her hands. Ida watched with her. Neither of them said anything, but when the coyotes were gone, Ida reached over and put her hand on Opal's wrist for maybe 3 seconds, which was Opal understood the most physically demonstrative thing her grandmother had done in 11 years. Then Ida took her hand back, and she said, "Go to bed," and Opal did. Coming up in a few minutes, a letter is going to arrive at the house that is going to change everything. Opal thought she understood about her grandmother, and about why her grandmother had never called any of the cousins home for help, and about why the farm had really been dying for 20 years. But first, there is one more thing you need to know about that July. Because while the coyotes were the thing Opal saw coming, there was another thing coming she could not see, and it had a return address from the First National Bank of Casey County, and it had been coming since 2019. The letter came on a Thursday afternoon in the last week of July. Opal was in the barn. She had been building a night pen with lumber Otis's father had donated from a torn-down tobacco barn. It was slow work. She was not good with a hammer yet, though she was getting better. She heard the mail truck stop at the box down at the county road. She heard it drive on. She did not go check the mail until she came up to the house at 5 to start supper. There were 3 pieces: a grain feed catalog, an electric bill, and a business envelope from the First National Bank of Casey County, addressed to Mrs. Ida Whitfield. Opal set the mail on the kitchen table. Ida was in the front room in her chair, with a book open on her lap and her eyes closed. She was napping. It was one of the few things she did these days that her body had insisted on, and she had accepted. Opal did not wake her. She started supper: cornbread, beans, a piece of chicken from the freezer. She worked slowly because it was hot in the kitchen, and there was no reason to hurry. When Ida came in at 6:30 for supper, she saw the mail on the table. She stopped. She looked at the envelope from the bank. She stood there for a long moment. Then she sat down at the table and did not open it. Opal set the plates. Ida picked up her fork, set it down, picked it back up. She did not eat. Opal, watching this, said, "Are you going to open it?" Ida said, "Not tonight." Opal said, "Do you want me to?" Ida looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, "Sit down." Opal sat down. Ida said, "In the summer of 2019, my brother Roland got sick. He was 73, lung cancer. He had insurance, but not the kind that covers what he needed. He lived in Bowling Green. He didn't have children. He had me." Opal had heard of Roland. Roland was in a photograph on the mantle. He had come to her grandfather's funeral. He had died 2 years later. She had been at his funeral too, though she barely remembered it. Ida said, "I took a loan on the house, $18,000. I paid his medical bills with it. He died 6 months later. I have been paying on that loan since then, $240 a month, out of the Social Security." She looked at Opal. "I have not been able to make the last 4 payments since March. Since Opal had come home, since Ida had used the money she used to pay the note with Opal, understood without being told, to buy groceries for 2, to pay for the physical therapy the insurance didn't cover, to send $200 down to Madison County for a puppy she had ordered before Opal ever came home. Opal did not say any of this. She said, "How much is left?" Ida said, "About 6,000. "How long?" 90 days, they said in the last letter. "That letter came before you got here. I did not tell you." She looked at the envelope on the table. "I imagine this is the one that starts the clock." She still did not open it. She said, "I am sorry." She said it looking down at the table, and her voice, which Opal had never heard, shook. "I did not want you home for this reason. I did not want you home to save the place. I wanted you home because you were the only one who came when I called. That is all. I meant to sell it before you had to know." Opal reached across the table. She put her hand on her grandmother's hand. She said, "I'll open it." She opened the envelope. She read the letter. She read it twice. It said what Ida had known it would say. 90 days, $6,047, or foreclosure proceedings would begin. Opal folded the letter. She put it back in the envelope. She set the envelope on the table between them. She said, "We have the wool money, and the sheep are worth something now. If it comes to it, we can sell down." Ida said, "That is your work you would be selling." Opal said, "It is your house." Ida did not answer that. Opal said, "I need to think. Give me until Sunday." Ida nodded. They ate supper, or Ida ate supper. Opal moved food around on her plate and did not eat. That night, Opal took the ledger to bed with her, and she read the entry that had been circling in her mind since May. "Water comes up here from below. Do not disturb until needed." She sat up in bed with the ledger open on her lap, and she thought for the first time that she might know what her grandfather had meant by needed. She thought about the 11 wells drilled within 2 miles of the Whitfield place in the last 30 years. She had not researched them yet, but she had heard at the feed store that wells on this side of the ridge were mostly good. She had heard that men had struck water on farms all around them. She thought about the sentence in her grandfather's ledger. "I am probably wrong about the depth, but I am not wrong that it is there." And she thought about $6,047 and 90 days, and a grandmother who had called a puppy in March because she had been more prepared than her granddaughter for what was coming. Opal did not sleep that night, but sometime before dawn, she made a decision she was not yet ready to tell anyone about, not even her grandmother. She was going to drive into town on Monday morning. She was going to go to the county clerk's office, and she was going to ask to see the well records for the township. Every well, every strike, every dry hole, every log filed with the state since 1970. Because if her grandfather was right about what sat under the western fence line, then there was another way to save the farm besides selling sheep. And if he was wrong, she was going to find that out before she let her grandmother lose the only house she had ever lived in. She got out of bed at first light. She dressed. She went down to the kitchen. She put on the coffee. Ida came in a few minutes later in her housecoat. Ida did not usually come down before Opal called her, but she came down that morning. She looked at Opal. She said, "You didn't sleep." Opal said, "No." Ida said, "You have a plan." Opal said, "Not yet, but I mean to." Ida looked at her for a long moment. Then she said something Opal had not heard her say before. She said, "Your grandfather used to say that." Opal's throat closed. Ida turned, and she poured herself a coffee, and she carried it to the table, and she sat down, and she did not say anything else, but she looked at Opal across the table, and she smiled. For the first time in 11 years, it was a small smile, barely a smile at all, but Opal saw it, and Opal understood in that moment, sitting in the kitchen where her grandfather had died at that same table on a Tuesday morning 11 years before, that there were two things at stake now. There had always been two things at stake, and she had only been seeing one of them. There was the farm, and there was her grandmother, and she was going to have to save them both. The white van came up the gravel drive on a Saturday morning in the first week of August. The name of a restaurant was painted on the side in the kind of clean lowercase lettering that told you the restaurant was not in Casey County. The man who got out of the van was maybe 35, thin, wearing a shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows and a canvas apron folded over his arm the way a mechanic carries a rag. He walked up to the porch where Opal was drinking coffee. He said, "Are you Opal Whitfield?" She said she was. He said, "My name is Dale Dinkins. My sister is Faye. She said you might have a lamb for me." Opal, who had known his sister's name for 6 weeks now and had been depositing checks from her every 3 weeks, did not know Faye had a brother, but she stood up and she said, "Come with me." They walked down to the middle pasture, which was where Opal had moved the flock the previous week after the lower pasture had begun to slow. She had read a book on rotational grazing that Faye had mailed her along with the June wool check, and she had been trying to do what the book said, which was to move the sheep before the pasture began to shorten and to let the grazed ground rest until the grass had come back to the height of the sheep's knees. The book had said this would double her carrying capacity within 3 years. She had thought that was optimistic. She was starting to believe the book. Dale walked the pasture with her for almost an hour, which was a thing Opal had not been expecting. She had thought he would look at the sheep, pick one, load it, and go. Instead, he walked slowly. He stopped and looked at the grass. He stopped and looked at where the sheep were grazing. He watched the flock move down the fence line, and he watched them turn. He asked questions. He asked what she was feeding them. Nothing but grass and a mineral block, she said. He nodded. He asked what breed they were. Tunis crosses, she said. Unimproved. Out of a foreclosed farm 2 counties over. Bought at auction in May. He nodded again. He asked what the sheep drank in the hot part of the afternoon. Opal thought about how to answer that. She said, "There is a stretch of creek at the western fence. The water comes up cold there. They drift to it around 2 o'clock and stay there until 4. Dale looked at her. He did not say anything for a long moment. Then he said, "Show me a lamb." Opal walked him down through the flock. She had 4 lambs she was willing to sell. 2 of them she would have kept for breeding if she had the pasture for it. She did not. Dale looked at all 4. Then he pointed at the small ewe lamb who was standing behind her mother at the edge of the group. She was the smallest of the 4. She had been born small. Her mother was the ewe Opal had been calling Lean's daughter, though Lean's daughter had been Lean's daughter for exactly 6 weeks in April before her mother had been killed by the Coyotes. Opal had bottle-fed her for 2 weeks. She had come out of it thin, but she stood on her own legs now, and she had a way of standing that Opal had noticed and had not been able to name. Dale said, "That one." Opal said, "That was the one I was going to keep." Dale said, "I know it. That's why I want her." Opal said, "Why?" Dale looked at the lamb. He looked at the pasture. He looked at the western fence line. He said, "Because she has been eating what the ground gave her, and nothing else, and you can see it in how she stands." He said it the way Ellis Booker had said, the wool was not bad wool, which was, as a craftsman recognizing the work of another craftsman. Opal did not know what to say. Dale said, "How much?" Opal, who had priced the other lambs at $90, had not priced this one, because she had not been going to sell it. She said, "I don't know." Dale said, "I'll give you $240. Opal said, "For a lamb." Dale said, "For that lamb." She stood there for a moment. $240 was more money than she had ever been given for a single animal. It was almost 15 times what she had paid at the auction for a full-grown ewe. She said, "All right." Dale wrote her a check on the tailgate of his van. He loaded the lamb himself, gently, talking to her the way you talk to a child you have just met. Before he drove away, he said, "I'm gonna put her on my menu next week, under the name of your farm. Would you object to that?" Opal said no. He said, "Would you object to my telling my friends about you?" Opal said, "How many friends?" Dale said, "Enough that you'll want to think about how many lambs you can spare next spring." He drove down the gravel drive. Opal stood in the yard with a check for $240 in her hand. Ida from the porch said, "What was that?" Opal said, "I think that was something." Ida said, "You look like a woman who just found out she is worth more than she thought she was." Opal said, "I feel like one." She went inside, and she sat down at the kitchen table, and she looked at the check for a long time. Then she opened her notebook, and she wrote down what Dale had said about the lamb, word for word, and she underlined it, because she was beginning to understand something the sheep and the ground, and her grandfather's ledger, and now Dale Dinkins had all been trying to tell her at once. The lamb was not what she was selling. What she was selling was the ground, and the way the ground had made the lamb. And there was for a young woman on a 68-acre ridge in Casey County, Kentucky, with a dead grandfather's ledger and a grandmother with $6,000 of debt hanging over her head, a great deal of ground. If you have ever known someone who was told their whole life that what they had was worth nothing, and then found out from a stranger that it was worth everything? Take a second right now to tell me about them in the comments. I want to hear it. Now, back to Casey County. She drove into Liberty on the Monday morning after Dale's visit. She parked in front of the county clerk's office at 8:45. She waited in her car until the office opened at 9. She went inside, and she told the clerk at the counter what she wanted. The clerk was a woman in her 50s who had been at that desk for 19 years. She knew who Opal was because she had known Silas Whitfield. She asked no questions. She led Opal into a back room and pulled out the drawer that held the well permits for the township, and she left her to it. Opal spent 4 hours in that back room. She went through every permit filed within a 2-mile radius of the Whitfield place in the last 30 years. She wrote down the location of each well. She wrote down the depth of the strike. She wrote down whether the well had come in wet or dry. And she wrote down, when she could find them, the geological notes the drillers had filed with the state at the time of the completion. By noon, she had a picture of the 11 wells drilled within a 2-mile radius of the Whitfield place in the last 30 years. 9 of them had hit water at depths between 58 and 84 feet. The 2 that had not hit water had been drilled on the far side of the county road, on what the drillers' logs described in the language of men who spent their lives in the ground as the opposite side of a fault trending northeast to southwest through the parcel. She turned to the ledger, which she had brought with her. She turned to the page where her grandfather had drawn the fault line across the map with an arrow, and the words in his careful hand, "Stops here." She sat back in the chair. She sat there for a long moment. Then she went back to the drawer. She had not been looking for it. She was looking still for the underlying pattern, for the confirmation. But there was another drawer in that office, marked with the older permits, the ones filed before the state had started keeping electronic records. She pulled that drawer. She found what she found in a folder marked with a permit number from 1978. Cyrus Beecham had drilled a test well on his own property in the summer of that year. The permit was in his name. The drill log was in the hand of a driller who had died in 1994. The log ran to 2 pages, and it ended on the second page with 2 words written in block letters and underlined twice: "No water." Opal read that page. She read it twice. Then she went back to the drawer, and she found 2 more. A second test well in 1982 on a different parcel of the Beecham property, 200 yards east of the first. No water. A third test well in 1985 on a parcel down near the county road. No water. 3 test wells, 57 years of adult life, 400 acres of bottomland. And Cyrus Beecham, the man who had laughed at her in the auction ring and who had driven up the gravel drive the morning after the Coyote attack to tell her he had told her so, had never once put a well in on his own land that had come in with water, because his 400 acres of bottomland sat on the wrong side of a fault line, the same fault line her grandfather had drawn on a map in 1958 with an arrow and 2 words: "Stops here." Opal sat in that back room for another 20 minutes. Then she photocopied everything. She paid the clerk $7.40 for the copies. She drove home. She did not stop at the feed store. She did not stop at the diner. She drove home. because there were things a woman needed to do alone at her own kitchen table with the sound of the ridge coming in through the window. Now let me stop here for 1 minute, because what Opal was about to sit down with at that kitchen table was going to change how she saw the man who had mocked her for 4 months, and it was going to change how she saw her grandmother, who had been on the porch that morning and who was going to be on the porch when she got home. But it was also going to change something else, something that had happened in the year 1966, 60 years before Opal ever bought a sheep, something her grandmother had almost told her once and had not. Because sometimes the story your family has not told you is the story that explains everything else. She spread the photocopies out on the kitchen table when she got home. Ida was in the front room in her chair. Opal called her in. Ida came slowly on the cane she had been using since May. She looked at the papers on the table. She sat down. She did not ask what they were. Opal said, "Grandma, in 1978, Cyrus Beecham drilled a well on his own property. It came in dry. In 1982, he drilled another, dry. In 1985, he drilled a third, dry." Ida did not react at first. Then she reached out and she picked up the top photocopy and she held it in front of her and she read it slowly all the way through. She set it down. She said, "Well," then she said, "I did not know about 82 or 85. Opal said, "But you knew about 78. Ida looked up. She said, "I knew he drilled that year. I did not know where or how it came out." Opal said, "Grandma." Ida said nothing. Opal said, "There is something you have not told me." Ida looked at her for a long moment, and then she looked down at her hands, which were folded in her lap, and which, for the first time Opal could remember, looked old. Ida said, "Sit down." Opal sat. Ida said, "In the spring of 1966, I was 21 years old. Cyrus Beecham was 19. I was engaged to him." Opal did not move. She did not breathe. Ida said, "It had been arranged in a manner of speaking by our two families. His people had money. My people had this ridge. It was not an unusual arrangement in that time. Neither one of us objected to it because neither one of us knew any better." She looked out the window, at the pasture, at the ridge line beyond. "Then in July of that year, I went to a wedding in Somerset. Your grandfather was there. He was 28, 10 years older than Cyrus. He had already been working the ridge for 6 years by himself since his own father had died. He was a quiet man. He did not ask me to dance. He walked me out onto the porch of the church and he asked me if I wanted a glass of water." She was quiet for a long moment. "I broke it off with Cyrus 3 weeks later. I married your grandfather in April of 1968. Opal said, "Cyrus." Ida said Cyrus did not take it well. She looked at Opal for the first time since she had started talking. "That is what I have been able to say for 60 years, that he did not take it well. There is more to it, but I am not going to tell you the rest of it tonight." Opal said, "Grandma." Ida said, "Not tonight." She stood up slowly on the cane. She said, "I need to go to bed. I need to sit with this." She walked out of the kitchen. She stopped at the doorway. She said without turning around, "Your grandfather was the finest man I ever knew. What I did in 1966, I did because I was 21 and I met a finer man than the one I had been promised to. I have never regretted it. Not one day, not 1 hour." Then she said, "But there was a cost, and I have paid on that cost for 60 years, and I will finish telling you about it when I am ready, and not before." She went to her room. Opal sat at the kitchen table with the photocopies in front of her. She did not touch them. She sat there until it got dark, and she did not turn on a light, because some kinds of stories are best received in the dark, where the shape of a thing does not distract you from the weight of it. Dale Dinkins called on a Wednesday. He called from his restaurant. He said he had, in the 10 days since he had taken the lamb, put her on his menu with a small line of text underneath the dish that named the farm and the county, and that in those 10 days he had received 4 phone calls from other restaurant owners, 1 in Louisville, 1 in Lexington, 2 in Cincinnati. They all wanted lambs from Opal's flock. Specifically, Opal, who had not put a name on her farm because she had not thought of the farm as needing a name, said, "What did you call it on the menu?" Dale said, "Whitfield Ridge." Opal was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That will do." Dale gave her the names and numbers of the 4 restaurants. He told her to set a price and to hold it. He told her not to sell more than she could replace in a single lambing season. Opal called Faye that evening. Faye told her the same thing in different words. She sat down at the kitchen table that night with the notebook, and she worked out slowly and with many crossings out how many lambs she could sell each year without shrinking the flock. The number was 26. She called the 4 restaurants back the next morning. She told each of them what she could supply and what the price would be. She had set the price at $220 a lamb, which was $20 less than what Dale had paid for the first one, because she had not yet developed the nerve to charge what Dale had charged himself. 3 of the 4 said yes on the phone. The 4th said he would call her back. He called her back a week later. He said yes. Opal sat down that Friday night at the kitchen table and added up the numbers on the back of a feed receipt. 26 lambs at $220 a lamb, plus the fall wool clip which Faye had already promised to buy at the same rate as the spring clip, plus the 7 ewes she planned to sell in October to the small farmers Faye had been sending her way. The total, when she added it up, was slightly more than $11,000. She showed the feed receipt to her grandmother that evening. Ida had come out of the bedroom on Thursday morning as if the conversation on Monday night had not happened. She had made breakfast. She had eaten it. She had gone back to the mending she had been working on. And Opal, who had understood that this was how it was going to be, had let it alone. Ida took the feed receipt. She looked at it for a long moment. She said, "That is enough to pay off Roland." Opal said, "It is." Ida said, "With something left." Opal said, "Not much, but some." Ida set the feed receipt down on the arm of her chair. She said, "Then you will pay it on Monday, and you will bring me the paid stamp on the paper, and you will put it in the drawer with your grandfather's things, and we will not speak of it again." Opal said, "Yes, ma'am." Ida said, "That is a year's living on this ridge. 9 head at auction paid for what a family has taken 60 years to lose. Your grandfather," she said, and stopped. She did not finish the sentence. She said instead, "The place will tell you what it wants if you give it 2 seasons to speak." That was what he used to say. Opal said, "I found that sentence in the ledger." Ida said, "He said it many times." Then she said, "Go to bed. You have work in the morning." Opal went to bed. She lay awake for a long time, but she was not lying awake in the way she had been lying awake in July, not with the weight of a debt on her chest, not with the dread of what tomorrow's mail might bring. She was lying awake with the ledger open on her nightstand, and her grandfather's handwriting under her hand, and a sentence he had written 68 years before, echoing in her head like water moving through stone. The place will tell you what it wants, if you give it 2 seasons to speak. The banknote was paid on Monday morning at the First National Bank of Casey County, $6,047 in a certified check. Opal brought Ida with her. Ida walked into the bank on her cane. She sat in the loan officer's cubicle while Opal wrote the check. She took the paid stamp from the woman herself, and she carried it out to the truck folded in half in her pocket. They did not speak in the truck on the drive home, but Ida sat straighter than she had sat in months. Winter came in the first week of December with a hard freeze and 4 inches of snow. Opal and Otis spent 2 days moving the flock into the lee of the hardwood stand and stringing a windbreak of pallets and tarps along the north side of the makeshift fold. Brindle slept in the middle of them every night with one eye open. The coyotes came down off the ridge twice in January. Brindle turned them back both times. No blood, no loss, just yellow eyes and 95 pounds of dog who had decided this ground was his. By the end of February, when the first lambs began to drop, Opal had not lost a single sheep to weather or predation since November. The flock had grown through births to 96 animals, 6 more than she had started with in May, and she was by any measure she could think of no longer a person who had made a mistake at the auction. The lambs at spring changed everything, although the change, like all the changes on the Whitfield place, came slowly and without an announcement. There were 43 lambs by the end of March. 3 died in the first week, which Ellis Booker, when Opal called him for advice on a Thursday evening, said was lower than average for a first lambing on a new place. 1 ewe died in a difficult birth Opal could not have prevented. She buried her at the edge of the hardwood stand next to Lean and the 3 from the previous spring. She marked the spot in her notebook. She sat on the porch with Ida that evening for a long time before she said anything. Then she said, "I lost one today." Ida said, "I know." Then Ida said, "You will lose more." Then she said, "But you will lose fewer than most, because you watch." Opal had heard those exact words before, on a morning in July, in the same voice, in the same chair. She heard them differently now. She said, "Yes, ma'am." Ida said, "Good." By April, the lambs were on the ground and on their feet. The middle pasture had recovered from the fall grazing. It had come in earlier and thicker than any pasture in the valley. Otis's father, who drove past on the county road most mornings, mentioned it at the feed store in the second week of April in a tone of mild puzzlement. Cyrus Beecham, who was there, said the Whitfield place had always had a few odd patches, and that one good spring did not make a pasture. But he said it without the edge he had used in July. When he left the feed store that morning, he drove the long way home, which took him past the Whitfield place. He slowed down on the county road, and he looked at the middle pasture for a long moment before he drove on. He did not stop. He did not wave, but he looked, and the looking was, although neither he nor Opal would have called it that, the beginning of something that would take another 4 months to finish. The second spring on the ridge told her what her grandfather had said it would tell her. The green patch in the lower pasture came up first and stayed greenest longest, and on a morning in the second week of April, Opal walked down to it with a shovel and dug a hole 3 feet deep in the middle of it. At the bottom of the hole in soil, that should have been dry that early in the year, water seeped slowly in. She stood looking at the hole for a long time. Then she filled it in, and she walked back to the house, and she opened the ledger to the page where her grandfather had drawn the lower pasture, and she found in the middle of the green patch a small numbered circle she had noticed before but had not understood. The number was 23. She turned to the back of the ledger, and she found entry 23, and her grandfather had written in his careful hand, "Perched aquifer sits on clay, recharges from the ridge, would yield a small spring if open." Below that, in slightly different ink, as though added later, he had written, "Do not open until you have a use for it." Opal closed the ledger. She sat at the kitchen table for a long time. Her grandmother, who had been watching her from the doorway without her knowing, said, "You found another one." Opal said, "Yes." Ida said, "He used to say there were 7. He only ever opened one, the one that fed the house." She said it without sentiment, the way she said everything. "The others he left, for whoever came after." She walked slowly back to her chair, sat down, picked up her sewing. Opal sat at the kitchen table with the ledger closed under her hand, and she thought about the word use, which her grandfather had underlined. Coming up in a minute, a man named Rufus Bowen is going to drive up the gravel drive with a drilling rig on a flatbed trailer, and Opal is going to hand him a ledger from 1958, and what he is going to do at 71 feet below the lower pasture is going to change the way 3 counties talk about the Whitfield place for the next 20 years. But first, Opal has to make a phone call. She made the call on a Tuesday afternoon in the last week of April. The name in the back of her notebook was Rufus Bowen. Ellis Booker had given her the name in November when she had asked him in passing over coffee who the best well man in Casey County was. Ellis had said Rufus. Rufus was 63. He had been drilling wells in the Cumberland foothills for 34 years. He had drilled 7 of the 11 wells Opal had found in the county clerk's file. He had been the one to log all 7 strikes. She called him from the kitchen phone. She said her name. She said whose granddaughter she was. Rufus said, "I knew your grandfather." Opal said, "I have his ledger from 1958. I want you to come look at it." There was a long pause on the line. Then Rufus said, "I'll be there Tuesday." He came on Tuesday. He was a tall man, thin through the shoulders, gray hair cut close to the scalp, hands that had been doing what his hands did for so long that they no longer looked like separate hands. They looked like tools that had grown out of him. He walked the property with Opal for 2 hours. He did not talk much. She showed him the ledger. He sat on the porch with it open across his knees, and he read, in the way of a man who had seen many homemade maps in his life and had learned not to dismiss any of them. At the end of 2 hours, he closed the ledger. He said, "Your grandfather knew his ground." Opal said, "He did." Rufus said, "This aquifer in the lower pasture, the number 23. Can you show me where?" Opal walked him to the green patch. Rufus stood in the middle of it. He walked to the edge. He knelt down and put his hand on the soil. He stood back up. He said, "I can drill you a test well here for $1,400. I will know within a day whether there is water, and within a week how much." Opal said, "How sure are you?" Rufus looked at the ridge, at the fault line running along the county road, at the map in her grandfather's ledger, which he was still carrying under his arm. He said, "I have not been wrong about this ground for 18 years. Opal wrote him a check from the Lamb money. He said he would come back the following Monday. He came back the following Monday. He came in the morning with his rig on a flatbed trailer and a helper and a tanker truck for the drilling water, and he set up in the middle of the green patch. Opal watched from the porch with Ida beside her. The drilling was slower than Opal had expected. Rufus had said it would take a day, but by 2 in the afternoon, the bit was still at 42 feet, and Rufus had told her twice that patience was the thing. At 3:15, Opal walked down to the rig. Rufus was standing at the drill head. He was looking at the return water in the trough. The color of it. The color was the color of clay slurry, which was what he had told her it should be. Clay, some sand, not much else. He said, "We're getting close." Opal said, "Close to what?" Rufus said, "The shelf your grandfather wrote about, if it's where he said it is." At 3:42, the drill dropped 6 inches into empty space. Rufus looked up. He said, "Fractured limestone." Then before Opal could ask what that meant, water began to come up the casing. It came up slow at first, then fast, and then it came up in a way that Opal had never seen water come out of the ground and did not have language for. Rufus took his cap off. He held it in his hand. He said, "Well." He looked at the water coming up the casing. He looked at the drill log on the clipboard. He looked at the ridge. He said, "That is the best flow I have hit in 5 years in this county." The water ran clean within 20 minutes. Rufus tested it the next day and told her at the kitchen table over coffee that it was as clean as any water he had pulled out of Casey County in a decade. He charged her another $600 to cap it properly and run a line to the barn. Before he loaded his rig on the flatbed, he said, "If you ever want to drill a second one, I will do it for cost, because I want to see what else is under that ridge." Opal said, "There are 6 more." Rufus looked at her. She said, "In the ledger, my grandfather mapped 7. This was 1. Rufus was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Miss Whitfield, your grandfather was a better douser than any man I ever knew, and I have known some good ones." He got in his truck. He drove down the gravel drive. Opal stood in the yard. Ida on the porch said, "Come up here." Opal came up. Ida said, "Sit down." Opal sat. Ida said, "It is time. I am ready to tell you the rest of it." She said, "In the spring of 1966, when I broke off my engagement to Cyrus Beecham, your grandfather went to see Cyrus at the Beecham farm. He went because he wanted to say to Cyrus, man to man, what he had come between us. He was that kind of a man." She was looking at her hands. Cyrus did not receive it well. There were words. Your grandfather went home. She paused. 3 days later, Cyrus came to see your grandfather on this porch, in this same doorway I am sitting in now. He had made a decision in those 3 days, and he had come to make an offer. She looked up. He offered your grandfather $12,000 in 1966, which was more money than your grandfather saw in 3 years at the feed cooperative. He offered your grandfather $12,000 in cash to break the engagement off from his end, to send me back, and to sell him the 30 acres along the western fence line as a package. Opal did not move. $12,000 was more money than my father had in the world. It was 3 years of a wage in that time. It was the kind of money that could have paid off the note on this house and put your father and his brother through the college your father wanted to go to and did not. It was the kind of money that changed a life. She was quiet. Your grandfather listened to it, all the way through. He let Cyrus finish. That was your grandfather's way. He did not interrupt a man. He let him finish. She looked at Opal. Then he hit him. She said it without embellishment. He hit Cyrus in the mouth. Once. Cyrus fell off the porch, into the yard. Your grandfather stood up. He said to Cyrus from the porch, "Get off my land." And he came inside, and he did not speak of it again for 47 years, until the night he died, when he told me, because he wanted me to know he had never, not for 1 hour, not for 1 minute, considered the offer. She stopped. I did not know about it until that last night. I did not know for 47 years what Cyrus Beecham had done. Opal said, "Grandma." Ida said, "Cyrus never spoke to your grandfather again. He never came onto this property until your grandfather was in the ground, and he made 3 offers in the years between for the piece of land with the water, because he could not in the end have the woman, but he thought he could have the land, and he thought if he had the land, he could have the water." She looked at Opal. He never had any of it. She looked out at the pasture, at the middle pasture where Brindle was walking the fence line with the ridge coming up gold behind him in the last of the sun. He drilled his 3 dry holes. He watched this place get poorer. He waited for my Silas to die. He waited for me to die. He waited for someone to come with sense and want to sell to him. And what came instead, she said, and turned to look at Opal, was you. Opal did not say anything. There was nothing to say. She sat on the porch with her grandmother in the golden light, and after a long time, Ida reached over, and she put her hand on Opal's wrist, the way she had done on the night the second Coyote pack had come and left again. She said, "Your grandfather would have liked this. He would have liked all of it." She said it warmly. For the first time in 11 years, Opal put her hand over her grandmother's hand, and they sat that way for a long time. The word about the well traveled faster than the word about the wool or the lambs, because a well in that part of the county was a thing every farmer paid attention to, and because Rufus Bowen, who was not a gossip, but who was a truthful man, answered honestly when asked at the feed store about what he had found on the Whitfield place. He said the flow was the best he had hit in 5 years. He said the girl had a map her grandfather had made 68 years ago, and that the map had been right. He said it in the tone of a man reporting weather, and the men at the feed store received the news in a silence that lasted longer than any silence that had followed any of Cyrus Beecham's previous predictions. Cyrus himself was at the feed store that morning. He did not say anything for a long moment after Rufus finished. Then he said, "Well," then he said, "That is something." Then he paid for his salt, and he walked out to his truck, and he sat in the cab for a while before he started the engine. When he finally drove home, he drove past the Whitfield place again, and this time he stopped, and he sat in the truck at the end of the gravel drive for almost 5 minutes before he put it in reverse, and he backed onto the county road, and he drove on. He came back 2 weeks later on a Saturday morning in the first week of August, and this time he drove up the gravel drive, and he parked beside the barn, and he got out of the truck, and he stood with his hands in his pockets until Opal came out of the house. She came out wiping her hands on a dish towel. She stopped on the porch when she saw him, and the two of them looked at each other across the yard for a long moment. Then Cyrus said, "Morning." Opal said, "Morning." Cyrus said, "I came to see the well." Opal said, "All right." She walked him down to the lower pasture, and the two of them stood at the capped wellhead in the middle of what had once been the green patch, and which was now, since the line had been run to the barn, a slightly muddied circle of trampled grass. Cyrus looked at the cap for a long time without saying anything. Then he said, "Your grandfather and I did not get along." Opal said, "I know." Cyrus said, "He was right about a number of things I told him he was wrong about." He said it without looking at her, in the tone of a man reading from a list he had been carrying around for a long time. Then he said, "I told a lot of people at that auction last May that you had thrown your money away." Opal said, "I know that too." Cyrus said, "I was wrong." He did not say it loudly. He did not make a large production out of it. He said it the way a man says a thing he has decided he is going to say and has rehearsed in his truck on the drive over. Then he stood looking at the well cap for another long moment. Then he said, "If you ever need a second pair of hands, or a trailer, or a man to stand at a sale ring and not bid against you, you call me." Opal said, "I will." Cyrus said, "All right then," and he walked back up to his truck, and he got in, and he drove down the gravel drive. And he did not come back for almost a month. When he did come back 3 weeks later, he came in the pickup with a trailer hitched behind it, and a Suffolk breeding ewe in the trailer. He said he had taken her in on a trade at the yard and could not use her. He refused payment for her. He said it in the tone of a man who was going to say it once and not again. Opal took the ewe. She put her in with the flock in the middle pasture. The Suffolk walked into the flock and put her head down and began to eat, and Brindle came over and smelled her and went back to what he had been doing, and the Suffolk was from that moment on just another sheep on the Whitfield place. That was the entire arc of Cyrus Beecham's conversion, accomplished without ceremony, without further reference, the way most real things in that valley were accomplished. Ida watched from the porch when he brought the ewe. She did not go down. She did not wave. But when he pulled out of the drive, she said, "That is done." Opal said, "It is done." Ida said, 60 years. Opal said, 60 years. Then Ida said, "I have something for you." She stood up on her cane. She walked into the house. She came out with a folded piece of wool over her arm. It was a shawl, cream-colored, with a herringbone pattern that Opal did not know how her grandmother's hands remembered making, because Ida had not knit in 11 years. Ida said, "From the June clip, I have been working on it since July, when I thought we were going to lose the house." She held it out. She said, "I wanted you to have it if we did, so you would have something to remember it by." Opal took the shawl. She held it against her cheek. The wool smelled of the ridge, of the barn, of her grandmother's hands. She said, "Grandma." Ida said, "Now you have it anyway, and we did not lose the house, so it is for something else." Opal said, "For what?" Ida said, "For whatever you decide." They sat on the porch for a long time. The sun went down behind the ridge. The field went blue and then black. Somewhere in the hardwood stand, a coyote called once. Brindle in the middle pasture lifted his head. He did not bark. He was 95 pounds now, and he did not need to bark. The coyote did not call again. That night, after her grandmother had gone to bed, Opal took the ledger to the kitchen table. She turned to the last page, which she had not read carefully before. On that page, her grandfather had written in the same careful hand as everything else a list, 7 items, each one numbered, each one keyed to a location on the map. Number 1 was the well that had fed the house. Number 23 was the well Rufus Bowen had drilled in April. The other 5 were still there, marked, located, waiting. Below the list, in the same handwriting, but in ink that looked older than the rest, her grandfather had written a sentence. The place will tell you what it wants, if you give it 2 seasons to speak. Opal read the sentence 3 times. She closed the ledger. She put it back on the shelf above the kitchen table, where she had begun keeping it in the last week of April. She turned off the kitchen light. She went to the porch. She stood there in the dark for a long time, looking out at the ridge and at the pasture and at the shape of Brindle in the middle of the flock, 95 pounds of white in the dark. Somewhere behind her in the house, her grandmother was sleeping. Somewhere below her, in the ground beneath the ridge, 5 more aquifers were sitting on their beds of clay, waiting. Somewhere across the valley, an old man was sitting in his truck in his own driveway in the dark, thinking about a young woman in a canvas jacket who had raised a paddle in an auction ring on a morning in May, and had bought 90 sheep nobody wanted, and had, without meaning to, without knowing what she was doing, without any plan at all, brought a piece of ground back from 20 years of dying. He was going to sleep well that night, for the first time in 60 years. And Opal Whitfield on her porch above the ridge, with her grandmother's shawl over her shoulders and her grandfather's ledger closed on the kitchen table behind her, understood at last what her grandfather had meant by the word needed. Needed was not need. Needed was what came after the need was gone. Needed was what you had left when you had done what the ground had asked of you, and the ground had answered back. Needed was a woman on a porch, and a grandmother in a bed, and a dog in a pasture, and 5 more aquifers under the ridge, and a life that had, without her having quite decided it, become her life. She stood on the porch until the moon came up over the ridge. Then she went inside. She turned off the porch light. She went to bed. And somewhere in the last thoughts before she slept, she remembered a sentence her grandmother had said to her on a morning in April, on the porch, in the same chair, before any of this had happened. She had said, "Well, you came." Opal in the dark in the small room where her father had slept as a boy said out loud to no one but herself and the ridge and the ground under it and the 6 generations of Whitfields who had lived and died on the ridge before her, "Yes, ma'am, I came." And she slept, and in the pasture below the sheep slept too, and the ridge held them, and the water sat on its bed of clay, and the ground, having spoken, was quiet. For now,